Chapter 3, March 20th, 1862. The following morning at work, Emma heard some surprising news. A trooper from Company B came to visit a sick friend, and the men talked about a newcomer to the troop's outfit, a certain Lieutenant Vesey. Emma's ears perked up. Asking questions, she learned that the officer's first name was James, and that he was a tall man with sandy hair and a bushy mustache. "Where's he from?" she asked. The rifleman shrugged. "Don't rightly know, Thompson. He transferred to us from a Boston company." Emma broke into a grin. She'd known James Vesey when they were both living in Boston some years ago. They'd been good friends before Emma had gone off to Michigan, and they'd lost touch. But she often thought of the big sandy-haired man, and the memory brought color to her face. The other girls in Boston had sometimes teased her about being sweet on James, but in her blunt, straightforward way, Emma had laughed it off. Stuff and nonsense. She had much too much to do and certainly no time for romantic interests. Yet here they both were, in the same regiment. Emma felt her cheeks reddening. Romance. Fiddlesticks. She simply wanted to see her old friend again. Where was the harm in that? When her shift ended, Emma washed up quickly, straightened her uniform, tilted her cap, and set off for the Company B area. Hurrying along, she was surprised at the depth of her feelings. Well, she and James had enjoyed fine times together in Boston, and she'd missed him afterward, quite a lot. He was so hearty and good-humored. He had a lovely way with him, always cheering her up when she needed it. Imagine finding him again. What a coincidence! Of course, she'd have to play out her role and pretend to be Frank Thompson, but maybe he wouldn't see through her disguise. In those days, she'd worn her hair long, in a bun at the nape of the neck. Now it was short. The army uniform would help, and her face had matured quite a bit. She'd keep her cap low and hope for the best. Bother, it was confusing. She might just let him in on the secret anyway. Somehow she knew he'd understand and could be trusted. But she'd deal with all that later. Now she just yearned to see him, to talk to James and hear the booming laugh that always made her feel so warm and happy. Outside the company headquarter tents, pennants waved in the warm breeze. Excited, planning what she would say, she hurried along the line until she reached Company B. Some distance behind the last row of tents in a cleared field, Emma noticed a familiar ritual. A cluster of soldiers, bareheaded, stood around a mound of earth while the chaplain read a psalm. His voice carried to her on the breeze. "Commit thy way unto the Lord. Trust also in him, and he shall bring it to pass." Emma stopped near a gunner who was leaning on an artillery piece watching the service. "Right sad about Lieutenant Vesey," he muttered. Emma froze. "Who?" "Vesey," the gunner answered. "He took a patrol out for the first time last night. They ran into a big rebel party, and there was a fight. Our lads got back safe 'cept for the lieutenant. Took a musket ball in his neck. Dead by the time they brought him in. The Lord knoweth the days of the upright, and their inheritance shall be forever." Emma walked numbly toward the group of mourners. Someone picked up a rough wooden cross and pushed it into the dirt at one end of the mound. Somebody else picked up a gold-braided hat and hung it on an arm of the cross. "For such as be blessed of him shall inherit the earth." There was a mist across Emma's eyes. Through it she stared at the crude lettering, Vesey J., Lieutenant, USA. It couldn't be. It wasn't possible. Just minutes before she'd been hurrying to see him, to meet this man who'd meant so much to her. More than she'd ever realized. Emma added numbers. James must have been about 30. Only 3 decades, and all that was left was a dirt mound lying at her feet like a grim joke. Time was a cheat. Now she'd never smile with him, or hear his voice, or warm to his laughter. "Wait on the Lord and keep his way, and he shall exalt thee to inherit the land." Emma turned away feeling sick, the chaplain's words trailing after her. Her mouth was sour with the taste of pain. Slowly it turned to anger. There would be thousands of Veseys before this was over, thousands dead before the country was whole again. When she'd enlisted, she pictured herself starting on a fine, glorious adventure. Her way had seemed so safe and secure, but all that was a myth. In war there was no safety. Dirt mounds covered dreams as well as corpses. Took a musket ball in his neck, dead by the time they brought him in. Something began to stir in Emma. The imp was coming back to life, whispering, taunting her. For a while she felt very pleased with her masquerade, even a little smug. Now those feelings were passing, and old fires were starting to smolder. Fighting back tears, Emma stumbled blindly toward the hospital. Her path took her near a small cabin where the chaplain, Major Butler, lived with his wife. Emma knew Mrs. Butler, who often came to the hospital to visit patients and bring them treats from her kitchen. Emma and the older woman had become friends. Now, as she passed the cabin, some instinct drew her toward the front door. Suddenly she needed to talk, to see a kind face and hear a friendly voice. Distraught and barely aware of what she was doing, Emma stopped and knocked. Mrs. Butler opened the door, took one look at the young soldier standing there, and drew him inside. "Sit down, Franklin. Make yourself comfortable," she said, staring at Emma curiously. "I'll get us some hot coffee." Emma drank the coffee gratefully, leaned back in her chair, and closed her eyes. "Right sad about Lieutenant Vesey. Right sad about Lieutenant Vesey." All at once the tears came. Between her sobs she told Mrs. Butler about James, their friendship, her running to meet him, the shock of seeing the sad little grave. Emma's feelings overwhelmed her. Once started, she just couldn't stop. In next to no time out poured the rest of her secret. She talked about her need to be in the war, about posing as a man, and confessed her true name and identity. With a rush of relief, she blurted out everything that had been bottled up inside for so long. Mrs. Butler listened wide-eyed. "I declare," she murmured half to herself. "I declare." She came over, bent down, and put her arm around the young woman's shoulder. "Franklin, I mean Emma, I expect you were sent to me today. Things like this aren't accidents. It's too heavy a burden for you to carry alone. Time you had a friend and an ally." Emma blinked in surprise and relief. "You're not going to turn me in?" The chaplain's wife laughed. "My dear, I come from pioneer people. In '41 my folks drove a team and wagon from Independence clear to the Willamette Valley. We farmed the land when it was scarce more than a wilderness. That kind of thing puts iron in a woman." Mrs. Butler's eyes twinkled. "I confess, at first I was taken aback by your story, Lord, yes. But I do think you're a wonder." The gray-haired woman smiled and gazed out the little window. "If I were your age, I'm not sure I wouldn't try the same fool thing myself." Staring at Mrs. Butler, Emma realized it wasn't finished after all. Her secret was still safe. Hardly believing her good fortune, she wiped her nose, grinned at her new friend, and began talking again, filling in the details of her story. By the time she left the cabin, Emma felt much calmer. For a long time she'd been isolated and cut off. Now she could share her secret with Mrs. Butler, a partner as strong as she herself. But grief still burned inside, and the imp voice was getting bolder, stirring her discontent. Until this morning she'd been satisfied being Frank Thompson, Union field nurse. Now it all seemed so trivial. She had a fierce need to do more, to strike a real blow for the cause. She wanted to avenge James' death. She had to. But how? Emma fretted, but the glimmer of an answer came a few days later. A rumor spread through camp that one of the Union's key spies had been captured in Richmond and shot. McClellan had counted on this agent. Now the army was without ears and eyes, and someone had to fill the gap. Pressure from Washington was building, but the general refused to gamble. He insisted on more information before pushing ahead. Busy with her chores, Emma took in all the talk and gossip. The more she heard, the more her interest grew. An idea was slowly forming, a wild notion pushing its way into her awareness. When she saw what was happening, she was alarmed. The whole idea was mad, a fantasy, downright impossible. Yet here was the nagging voice again, coaxing, whispering, daring her to take new risks. Trust also in him, and he shall bring it to pass. Emma's faith was strong. Weakness wasn't in her nature. She'd faced fear many times and was ready to face it again. Of course, the whole thing might take more grit than she could muster, but how could you know the limits of your courage if you never put it to the test? That night, Emma hardly slept, tossing and turning, plagued by dreams of graves and crude crosses. At dawn, she awoke with a start, and her mind was crystal clear. She had her answer. She would try the impossible.